I awoke suddenly in the dead of night, jolted from a dreamless sleep by a sound that didn't belong. It was a soft, mournful crying, barely audible over the whisper of the wind against the window panes. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay still, straining to listen, hoping that I had imagined it. But the crying continued, a low, pitiful wail that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the house. My house. My empty house. I lived alone, had done so for years, ever since the divorce. There should have been no one else here. I sat up slowly, the old wooden floorboards creaking beneath my weight as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The room was dark, the faint light of the moon casting long shadows through the gaps in the curtains. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand, 3:07 a.m., the witching hour. The crying grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like a woman, her voice filled with sorrow and despair. I shivered, pulling on a sweater to ward off the chill that seemed to seep through the walls. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out where it was coming from. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside drawer and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The hallway outside my bedroom was empty, the doors to the other rooms closed. I took a deep breath and stepped out, the floor cold beneath my bare feet. The crying seemed to echo through the house, making it difficult to pinpoint its origin. I moved cautiously, my flashlight sweeping across the walls and floor, my heart pounding in my ears. I checked the guest room, the bathroom, even the closets. Nothing. As I approached the staircase, the crying grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from downstairs. I hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at the edges of my resolve. But curiosity and a strange sense of duty propelled me forward. I had to know. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the beam of my flashlight flickering slightly. The living room was empty, the furniture casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I paused, listening. The crying was louder now, coming from the direction of the kitchen. I moved slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the flashlight. The crying was louder here, almost deafening. It seemed to come from the pantry, a small room at the back of the kitchen. I approached the pantry door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The crying was so close now, as if the person was right on the other side. I took a deep breath and flung the door open, the flashlight beam revealing nothing. The pantry was empty, the shelves lined with cans and boxes. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? As I turned to leave, the crying started again, louder than ever, echoing through the small room. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting frantically across the shelves. And then I saw it, a small dark stain on the floor, barely visible in the dim light. It looked like blood. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was happening? Who was in my house? The crying grew louder still, filling my ears, drowning out my thoughts. I had to get out. I had to leave. I turned and ran, the flashlight beam bobbing wildly as I fled through the kitchen and into the living room. But as I reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The crying was all around me now, a cacophony of sorrow and despair. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside my head, an inescapable torment. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. And then I saw her. She was standing in the corner of the room, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She was dressed in a long, tattered gown, her hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. Her eyes were hollow, empty, and her mouth was twisted in a perpetual expression of grief. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. She just stood there, crying softly, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Please," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What do you want?" Her crying stopped abruptly, and she lifted her head, her empty eyes locking onto mine. "You," she said, her voice a hollow echo. "I want you." A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You took everything from me," she said, her voice growing louder, more insistent. "Now it's your turn." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening around me. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug and falling to the floor. The crying started again, louder and more intense, filling the room with its haunting sound. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around the room for an escape. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight. The front door was still locked, the handle refusing to turn. I was trapped. The woman took a step closer, her eyes fixed on mine. "You will suffer as I have suffered," she said, her voice a chilling whisper. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking. "I don't know what you're talking about." She took another step closer, her figure becoming clearer in the dim light. "You took my life," she said, her voice filled with a cold fury. "Now I will take yours." Panic surged through me and I backed away, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to escape. I turned and ran towards the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached the kitchen, the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The crying grew louder, more intense, echoing through the house. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside my head, an inescapable torment. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. And then I felt it, a cold, clammy hand gripping my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The crying grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I was trapped, alone in the house with a vengeful spirit. The woman's figure appeared in front of me, her hollow eyes filled with fury. "You will suffer as I have suffered," she said, her voice a chilling whisper. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the living room, the morning light streaming through the windows. The house was silent, the oppressive feeling of dread lifted. I sat up slowly, my head pounding. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? I looked around the room, searching for any sign of the woman or the crying, but there was nothing. The house was empty. But as I stood up, I noticed something on the floor. A small, dark stain, barely visible in the morning light. It looked like blood. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away, my mind racing. What had happened? Who was the woman, and what did she want with me? I knew I had to get out of the house, to leave and never look back. But as I reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The crying started again, louder and more intense, filling the house with its haunting sound. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never escape. Working the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital had always felt a bit eerie, but it was usually a manageable kind of eerie, more like the shiver you get when you think someone is watching you, only to find an empty hallway. The hospital was an old building, filled with creaking floors and drafty windows, its history woven into the fabric of its walls. Yet, despite the unnerving atmosphere, I had never experienced anything truly terrifying during my shifts. At least, not until that one night. It was a quiet evening, the kind that promised a long and uneventful shift. The ER was empty, except for a few patients sleeping off their various ailments, and the only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the distant hum of the ventilation system. My colleagues had all retreated to the break room, leaving me alone at the nurse's station to catch up on paperwork. As I was finishing up a particularly tedious chart, I heard a faint sound like the soft echo of footsteps down the hall. I paused, listening intently. The sound was so subtle that I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again, slightly louder this time. I looked up, expecting to see one of the night nurses returning from a coffee run, but the hallway was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the vast, empty corridor. There was no response, just the continued beeping of the monitors. I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping unease. It was probably just the building settling, I told myself. I returned to my paperwork, but the sound persisted, growing more distinct. The footsteps seemed to be moving closer, their pace slow and deliberate. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and peered down the hallway again. Still, there was no one there. Determined to find the source of the noise, I grabbed my flashlight and started walking down the hall, the beam cutting through the dim light. As I moved, the footsteps grew louder, echoing around me. They seemed to be coming from the old wing of the hospital, a section that had been closed off for renovations months ago. The door to the old wing stood ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond it. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but curiosity and duty pushed me forward. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the air immediately cooler and filled with the scent of antiseptic and decay. The old wing was a maze of darkened hallways and empty rooms, the flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The footsteps continued, echoing around me, leading me deeper into the labyrinth. I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached a room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly open, and the footsteps had stopped. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, my flashlight revealing an old, disused operating room. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. Rusty surgical tools lay scattered on a table, and the operating table itself was stained and cracked. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the room, but there was no one there. Panic surged through me as I tried the door, but it was locked tight. Then I heard it, a soft, whispering voice, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Help me," it whispered, the sound seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Please help me." "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The whispering continued, growing more frantic. I swept the flashlight around the room, my eyes scanning every corner, but there was no one. The voice grew louder, the words more desperate. "Help me. Please, don't leave me." I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I screamed, spinning around to face my unseen assailant. But there was no one there, only the empty room and the echo of my scream. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. I backed away, my heart racing, and stumbled against the operating table. As I did, something cold and wet touched my hand. I shone the flashlight down, and to my horror, I saw a dark, sticky substance, blood, seeping from the cracks in the table. Desperate to escape, I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my cries were met with silence. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. I felt a presence, something dark and oppressive, watching me from the shadows. Then, the whispering started again, louder and more insistent. "You can't leave," it hissed. "You belong here." I backed away, my flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. The darkness grew thicker, swallowing the weak beam of light. I felt a cold breath on my neck, and a chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, the room was plunged into complete darkness as the flashlight died. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, filling my ears with its relentless chant. "You can't leave. You can't leave. You can't leave." I stumbled through the darkness, my hands outstretched, searching for the door. My fingers brushed against something cold and solid, the wall. I followed it, my heart pounding, until I found the door handle. I twisted it frantically, and to my surprise, it opened. I stumbled into the hallway, the whispering fading as I left the room. The door slammed shut behind me, and I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. The old wing was silent once more, the oppressive feeling lifting as I made my way back to the nurse's station. I never spoke of what happened that night. When my colleagues asked why I looked so shaken, I just muttered something about a bad dream. But I knew the truth. I had encountered something in that old wing, something that still haunted the darkened halls of St. Mary's Hospital. I transferred to the day shift soon after, unable to face another night in that place. But even now, I can't escape the memory of that whispering voice, the cold hand on my shoulder, and the feeling of being watched. I still wake up in the middle of the night, the echo of those words ringing in my ears. "You can't leave. You belong here." I had lived in the same suburban neighborhood for almost a decade. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where children played in the streets until the streetlights came on, and neighbors exchanged polite nods and small talk over white picket fences. Life was predictable and comfortable, until the new family moved in next door. The Thompsons seemed nice enough at first. They kept to themselves, which was unusual in our close-knit community, but not necessarily a red flag. Their children, a boy and a girl, were quiet and well-behaved, often seen playing in their backyard but never mingling with the other neighborhood kids. The boy, Max, was around 10, and his sister, Lily, couldn't have been more than 8. It was a couple of weeks after they moved in that I first noticed something odd. It was late at night, and I was up reading in my living room. Through the large front window, I had a clear view of the Thompsons' house. A flickering light caught my attention, and I glanced up to see Max and Lily standing in their front yard, staring directly at my house. Their faces were blank, eyes wide and unblinking, illuminated only by the faint glow of the street lamp. It unnerved me, but I chalked it up to childish curiosity and tried to ignore it. I went to bed that night with an uneasy feeling, the image of their vacant stares lingering in my mind. Over the next few days, I saw them more frequently, always at night, always staring. It didn't matter if I was in the living room, the kitchen, or even my bedroom. Whenever I looked out the window, they were there, standing silently, their eyes fixed on me. I tried to talk to their parents about it, but the Thompsons were polite yet distant, assuring me their children were just adjusting to the new environment. One night, the staring escalated. I was jolted awake by a noise coming from the backyard. My heart pounded as I crept to the window and peeked outside. There they were, Max and Lily, standing just beyond the fence, their eyes glowing eerily in the moonlight. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was more than just childish curiosity. Something was very wrong. I decided to confront them. Throwing on a robe, I marched out into the backyard, determined to put an end to this unsettling behavior. As I approached the fence, Max and Lily didn't move or acknowledge my presence. Their eyes seemed darker, more hollow than before. "What are you doing out here?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. They didn't respond, didn't even blink. The silence was oppressive, the air thick with an unnameable dread. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible shadow flickering behind them, something dark and twisted that seemed to shift and writhe in the moonlight. Fear gripped me, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a garden hose. When I looked up again, they were gone, vanished into the night as if they had never been there at all. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me, my hands trembling. The next day, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just my imagination, or perhaps a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew there was something more sinister at play. I started paying closer attention to the Thompsons, watching for any clues that might explain the children's bizarre behavior. One evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, I noticed the Thompsons' house was dark, all the lights off despite the early hour. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I crept around to the side of their house, peering through a gap in the curtains. Inside, the Thompsons were gathered around a table, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of candles. They were chanting in low, guttural voices, their eyes closed, hands clasped together. Max and Lily stood at the center of the circle, their expressions blank, their bodies rigid. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably dark, a sense of malevolence permeating the air. I backed away, my heart racing, and hurried back to my house. I knew I needed to do something, but who would believe me? The police? My other neighbors? That night, the staring resumed. Max and Lily stood in my front yard, closer than ever before. Their eyes bore into mine, filled with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore them, closing the curtains and turning up the volume on the TV, but their presence was suffocating. Sleep was elusive, and when I finally drifted off, I was plagued by nightmares. Dark, twisted visions of the Thompsons and their children, their faces contorted into grotesque masks. I woke up drenched in sweat, the room feeling unnaturally cold. Desperation set in, and I decided to take matters into my own hands. The next night, armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread, I snuck into the Thompsons' backyard. I had to know what they were doing, what was behind the children's strange behavior. I approached the house, the chanting voices growing louder as I neared the window. I peered inside and saw the same scene as before. The Thompsons gathered around the table, the children at the center, the flickering candles casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, Max's head snapped towards me, his eyes locking onto mine through the glass. A sinister smile spread across his face, and he raised a hand, pointing directly at me. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the Thompsons turned in unison, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The darkness closed in around me as I ran, the sound of footsteps pursuing me, growing louder and closer. I reached my house and slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't sleep that night, every creak and groan of the house amplified by my fear. As dawn broke, I decided I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed a bag, planning to leave and never look back. But as I opened the front door, I froze. Max and Lily stood on the porch, their faces twisted into malevolent grins. Behind them, their parents watched, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You can't leave," Max said, his voice unnaturally deep. "We won't let you." The world seemed to tilt, my vision blurring as I backed away. The last thing I saw was their eyes burning into mine as darkness consumed me. When I woke up, I was no longer in my home. I was in a dark, cold place, the sound of chanting filling my ears. The Thompsons stood around me, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight. Max and Lily were there too, their eyes empty and soulless. "You belong to us now," Mr. Thompson said, his voice echoing in the darkness. As the chanting grew louder, I felt a cold, creeping dread settle over me. I knew I was trapped, bound to this place and these people, their dark rituals and twisted desires. There was no escape, no salvation. And as the darkness closed in, I realized with a chilling certainty that I would never be free. I had always been a light sleeper, the kind of person who would wake up at the slightest sound. My friends often joked that I could probably hear a pin drop in my sleep. But that changed after the accident. The night it happened, I had been driving home late, exhausted after a long day at work. I don't remember the crash itself, only the blinding headlights of the oncoming truck and the screeching of tires. When I woke up, I was in the hospital, surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of monitors. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive. I had suffered a concussion and a few broken ribs, but nothing life-threatening. They said I needed rest, time to heal. But from the first night I closed my eyes in that hospital bed, I knew something was wrong. The dreams started immediately, vivid and unsettling. At first, they were just disorienting, endless hallways, dark forests, strange faces. But then they grew darker, more sinister. The same figures began to appear, shadowy shapes lurking in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. And then there was the house. In my dreams, I always found myself standing before a decaying mansion, its windows dark and empty, its door slightly ajar. Every time I felt an inexplicable pull to enter, a compulsion I couldn't resist. Inside, the air was thick with decay and the faint, lingering scent of something foul. The house was a labyrinth of narrow, winding hallways and rooms filled with broken furniture and cobwebs. And always there were the whispers, soft and insistent, calling my name. One night, the dream took a darker turn. As I wandered through the house, I came upon a room I had never seen before. The door was heavy and old, the wood splintered and rotten. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. In the center stood a bed, and on that bed lay a figure, covered by a thin, tattered sheet. I felt my heart pound in my chest as I approached, a sense of dread washing over me. I reached out and pulled back the sheet, revealing a lifeless, decaying corpse, my own. I screamed and woke up, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But the feeling of being watched lingered, and I knew that whatever haunted my dreams was growing stronger. Each night, the dreams grew more intense, the line between reality and nightmare blurring. I tried to stay awake, drinking coffee and downing energy drinks, but exhaustion always claimed me in the end. And each time I fell asleep, I found myself back in that house, drawn deeper into its twisted embrace. One night, the dream took an even darker turn. As I wandered through the decaying halls, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They led me to a door at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The door was different from the others, newer, as if it had been recently installed. I pushed it open and found myself in a small, windowless room. The only light came from a flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was a chair, and in that chair sat a man. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unyielding. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. As he stepped into the light, I saw his face, a twisted, grotesque version of my own. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent chills down my spine. "You can't escape," he said, his voice echoing in the small room. "This is your reality now." I backed away, fear gripping me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This is just a dream. I can wake up." The man laughed, a sound that echoed through the room like shattered glass. "Can you?" he asked, his eyes boring into mine. "Are you sure?" I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallways twisted and turned, the house shifting around me. No matter how fast I ran, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. I stumbled and fell, the ground beneath me shifting and cracking. The walls closed in, and the darkness swallowed me whole. When I woke up, I was back in my hospital bed, the morning sun streaming through the window. But something was different. The room felt colder, the air thicker. I looked around, my eyes scanning the familiar surroundings, but everything seemed slightly off, like a distorted reflection in a funhouse mirror. I tried to get up, but my body wouldn't respond. Panic surged through me as I realized I was paralyzed, trapped in my own body. The door to my room creaked open, and the man from my dreams walked in, his smile cold and cruel. "Welcome back," he said, his voice a chilling whisper. "You can't escape. This is your reality now." I screamed, but no sound came out. The man approached, his eyes locked onto mine. "You're trapped," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. "Forever." The world around me shifted and twisted, the boundaries of reality and nightmare blurring. I could feel the darkness closing in, the whispers growing louder, and I knew with a chilling certainty that I would never wake up.